On the evening of July 16, 1945, as the sun fell behind the red-tiled roofs of Potsdam, and the world hovered between the end of one war and the beginning of an uncertain peace, Winston Churchill asked Harry S. Truman for a private conversation. The conference had moved slowly that day. Delegates exchanged polite phrases layered with hidden meaning. Maps covered tables. Coffee cups cooled beside ashtrays overflowing with cigarette ends. But beneath it all, beneath the speeches, beneath the rehearsed optimism, beneath the handshakes meant for the cameras, ran a current of tension that only two men fully understood. Truman was still new to the role. 95 days earlier, he had been a vice president kept outside the rooms where decisions were made. Now he sat at the head of the largest military machine in history, holding responsibilities Roosevelt had never explained. He had come to Potsdam determined to find clarity, to understand the world Roosevelt left him, and define America's place in the one emerging. Churchill, by contrast, had been living inside this world for years. He had watched its shape shift at Tehran, at Quebec, at Yalta, and across 1,000 battlefield reports. He felt its tremors more clearly than almost anyone alive. And that night, when most of the American delegation had returned to their quarters and only a few lamps still glowed across the courtyard, he told Truman there was something he needed to hear. Before we go further, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And if you enjoy content like this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video. It was not a formal briefing. It was not a diplomatic message. Churchill didn't even sit down at first. He paced the room slowly, hands clasped behind him, shoulders heavy beneath the weight of an empire still fighting to stay whole. Truman remained still, waiting, sensing that what Churchill was about to say was not part of the scheduled talks. The Prime Minister stopped, turned toward him, and delivered the warning that would echo through decades of history. "Mr. President," Churchill said quietly, "we must not make the mistake of believing the Soviet Union seeks only security. They seek influence. They seek dominion. They seek to shape Europe in their image, and they will not stop unless we stop them." It was the most direct warning Churchill had ever given the new American president. Not a request, not an analysis, an alarm. Truman listened, but his expression did not change. He had been reading reports from the State Department, hearing the concerns of American diplomats, reviewing cables from commanders on the ground. He had seen hints of what Churchill described, but he also knew that Roosevelt had approached the Soviets with a long view, one Truman had not yet fully reconstructed. Churchill saw the hesitation and pressed on. "I have spoken with Marshal Stalin," he said. "I have shared meals, exchanged notes, exchanged toasts, but he is not a man who yields to goodwill. He respects only strength. If we wait too long, we will find half of Europe taken before we even choose to respond." Truman did not disagree, but he did not agree either. Not fully, not yet. He asked Churchill what he proposed. The Prime Minister lowered his voice even further. "Firmness," he said. "A united front. A clear message that the liberties of Europe will not be bartered away. If we delay, we will live to regret it." Truman thanked him. Churchill bowed his head slightly, as though relieved to have spoken aloud what had been tightening in his chest for months. But what Churchill did not know, and what history would later reveal, was that Truman already had another piece of information weighing heavily on his mind. Earlier that very day, he had received a coded message from Washington containing 5 words that would shape every decision he made in the coming weeks. Operated this morning, successful. The Trinity test had worked. The weapon Roosevelt had hidden from him for months, the weapon he learned about only after taking the oath of office, was now real. In Truman's mind, the world had changed before Churchill even knocked on his door. Churchill continued speaking, describing Soviet movements in Poland, their tightening grip on Romania and Bulgaria, their intentions for Germany. He spoke of conversations with his military chiefs and warnings from intelligence officers. He spoke of a world dividing in half. He spoke of consequences that could last a century. Truman heard every word, but he also knew something Churchill did not. The United States now possessed a weapon capable of reshaping diplomacy entirely, a weapon that might end the war in the Pacific, redefine America's leverage, and alter the balance of power before any confrontation in Europe could begin. And so, at the worst possible moment, the moment Churchill believed required unwavering attention, Truman's focus drifted, not from carelessness, not from disrespect, but from the sheer enormity of the new reality he had just inherited. He reassured Churchill that he understood the dangers. He promised vigilance, but he stopped short of the full commitment Churchill sought. It was not until the next morning, when Truman took his seat beside Stalin at the green baize table, that Churchill realized something had shifted. Truman seemed more confident, more assured, more willing to push back when Stalin made sweeping claims about reparations and territorial adjustments. Churchill did not yet know why, but he sensed that Truman's attention was no longer solely on Europe, and this worried him. Over the next several days, Churchill repeated the warning, each time with greater urgency. He urged Truman to look beyond the closing chapter of the war and into the opening chapter of the peace. Stalin was consolidating power. Eastern Europe was slipping away. The Western Allies needed coordination, resolve, and immediate action. Truman listened, asked questions, weighed each argument carefully, but each time Churchill pressed, Truman hesitated. He had reasons, some practical, some political, some deeply personal. He did not yet fully understand Roosevelt's agreements. He did not want to appear confrontational in his first major foreign conference. He did not want Britain's waning empire dictating America's emerging strategy. And, most of all, he did not want to make any binding commitments until he understood the full implications of the atomic bomb. But to Churchill, hesitation looked like retreat. He watched Truman navigate the conference with the caution of a man still learning the map. And though Churchill admired Truman's honesty and straightforwardness, he worried that Truman did not grasp the urgency. By the time the conference drew to a close, Churchill believed Truman had made a grave mistake, one Churchill feared history would not forgive. But Churchill never got the chance to deliver his warning one last time. On July 26th, while Truman was still absorbing the Trinity test report and preparing to issue the Potsdam Declaration to Japan, Churchill received news that his party had lost the British election. After 5 years of wartime leadership, after guiding his nation through nights of fire and mornings of rubble, he was out. Clement Attlee would replace him the next morning. Churchill's bags were packed. His staff had already left their quarters. The man who had delivered the warning Truman most needed to hear was gone before the conference even ended. When the news reached Truman, he felt a stab of shock. He had grown accustomed to Churchill's presence, his humor, his insight, his theatrical style. Churchill had been the last voice capable of explaining Roosevelt's diplomatic world. And now, like Roosevelt, he was suddenly gone. Truman stood quietly for several minutes before returning to the negotiations. He did not show his concern, but he felt it. That night, Truman wrote in his diary, "I like him. I shall miss him." What he did not write, but surely felt, was something far heavier. Churchill had been the only leader pressing him to confront the crisis forming in Europe, and now that warning had no champion. In the weeks after Potsdam, Truman focused almost entirely on the war in the Pacific. He weighed the Japanese surrender terms, he reviewed casualty estimates, he received briefings from military commanders. All the while, Churchill's warning flickered in the background, heard, understood, but overshadowed by the urgency of ending the war. Then came Hiroshima, then Nagasaki, then the Japanese surrender. Truman had ended the war swiftly, decisively, and, he believed, mercifully compared to the cost of a full invasion. But, while the world focused on the Pacific, Churchill's warning unfolded quietly in Europe. Poland solidified under Soviet control. Romania and Bulgaria fell fully into Moscow's orbit. Soviet influence tightened across the zone Roosevelt once hoped would remain flexible. By the time Truman truly turned his attention back to Europe, the map Churchill had warned him about was already taking its new shape. And Truman, thinking back to that quiet night at Potsdam, realized something he would carry for the rest of his life. Churchill had not warned too early. Truman had listened too late. In the first weeks after the Japanese surrender, the White House was a place of both triumph and disquiet. The war that had consumed Truman's every waking hour for 4 months was over. Crowds had filled the streets in celebration. Church bells had rung across cities that had waited years for peace. Yet, behind the public relief, something else had begun to settle over Truman's thoughts. The memory of Churchill's warning, delivered with quiet urgency in the small room at Potsdam, was no longer a distant echo. It was becoming a shadow stretching across every report that arrived from Europe. At first, Truman tried to focus on the immediate tasks of peace. There were troop deployments to manage, supply chains to reorient, budgets to reconfigure, and veterans returning home in numbers so vast that the country strained to absorb them. But whenever he turned back to the diplomatic cables on his desk, he saw the same pattern emerging. Soviet officials were consolidating power in Poland, pushing aside moderates, and tightening their control over the security forces. In Romania, a similar process was unfolding. Ministers loyal to Moscow were replacing those who advocated for independence and multi-party governance. In Bulgaria, opposition voices were being arrested. And in the American zone of Germany, reports from military governors warned that negotiations with Soviet representatives were becoming increasingly strained, marked by delays, obstruction, and unilateral actions. Churchill's words returned to Truman with unwelcome clarity. If we wait too long, we will find half of Europe taken before we even choose to respond. Truman read the reports carefully, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times. The tension between the Allies had shifted from diplomatic disagreements to something more structural, a divergence in vision for the post-war order. Roosevelt's belief that cooperation could endure now looked fragile, almost naive in the cold light of Stalin's strategy. But Truman was still hesitant, not because he doubted Churchill and not because he failed to grasp the stakes. Rather, he understood something that Churchill, freed from the responsibilities of office, no longer had to account for. The American public had little appetite for another confrontation. Families wanted their soldiers home. Congress wanted spending reduced. The press wanted stories of victory, not warnings of a new rivalry. Truman also knew that the atomic bomb had not ended diplomacy. It had complicated it. American officials disagreed on how openly to use the bomb as leverage. Some argued that it gave the United States the upper hand. Others warned that displaying too much confidence might provoke the Soviets into accelerating their own weapons program. And Truman, caught between these competing pressures, found himself in the one position no president ever wants to be in, aware of danger, but unsure of how quickly to act. Through the autumn of 1945 and into the winter, Churchill watched the situation from the outside. Though no longer prime minister, he still received intelligence briefings as leader of the opposition. Each report strengthened his conviction that events were moving exactly as he had warned. He wrote letters to Truman, measured, respectful, but unmistakably urgent. In them, he reiterated his concerns about Poland, about the Balkans, about the future of Germany. He asked Truman to recognize the pattern unfolding, the one he had tried to describe at Potsdam. Truman read every letter. He admired Churchill. He did not dismiss him. But he also knew that Churchill's perspective, sharpened by years of confrontation with totalitarian enemies, was rooted in a worldview that sometimes saw threats more quickly and more broadly than others did. Truman moved cautiously. He instructed the State Department to increase reporting from Eastern Europe. He authorized diplomatic pressure in certain regions. He began reorganizing foreign policy agencies to improve coordination. Yet he still stopped short of the decisive public stance Churchill wanted. Privately, some of Truman's advisors worried about provoking Stalin prematurely. Others believed Stalin was simply behaving as great powers always did after war, expanding influence while the world reorganized. Truman listened to them all, weighing each argument, uncertain of which direction would define the future. Then, in early 1946, Churchill sent word that he wished to deliver a major address in the United States. Not in Washington, not in London, but in a small town in Missouri, Fulton, at the invitation of Westminster College. He asked Truman if he would attend. Truman agreed. He did not know precisely what Churchill planned to say, but he sensed that Churchill intended to speak more openly than he ever had before. On March 5, 1946, Truman rode beside Churchill through the streets of Fulton as cheering crowds lined the sidewalks. For many Americans, Churchill was still the lion of wartime Britain, the man whose speeches had carried a nation through its darkest nights. They waved flags, held children on their shoulders, and reached out to shake his hand. Truman watched all of it, knowing that Churchill's presence still commanded a level of moral authority unmatched by any living statesman. Inside the college auditorium, Churchill stepped to the podium, adjusted his glasses, glanced once at Truman seated nearby, and began. The speech would become one of the most famous of the century. He spoke of the accomplishments of the Western Allies. He praised American leadership. He honored the dead. But then his tone shifted. From Stettin in the Baltic, Churchill declared, to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The words hung in the air like a cold wind. Churchill described how Soviet influence was spreading, how free institutions were being suppressed, how political opposition was disappearing under the shadow of Moscow. He warned that without unity between the United States and Great Britain, the balance of power would tilt decisively in Stalin's favor. Truman remained still. He understood the speech's significance. He also understood the political storm it would unleash. For Churchill, the warning was a continuation of what he had said at Potsdam. For Truman, it forced a dilemma he could no longer postpone. If he supported Churchill's assessment publicly, he risked escalating tensions before the American public was ready. If he dismissed Churchill's warning, he risked ignoring a danger that was already becoming visible. In the days after the speech, reactions flooded newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic. Some praised Churchill's courage. Others condemned him as a warmonger trying to resurrect old rivalries. Stalin responded angrily, accusing Churchill of inciting conflict. Soviet newspapers called the speech a declaration of hostility. Through it all, Truman remained cautious. Publicly, he distanced himself from Churchill's harshest language. Privately, he acknowledged that the essence of the warning was true. The world was dividing, and the United States needed to choose how to respond. Spring turned to summer, and each new cable from Eastern Europe confirmed Churchill's prediction. Truman could no longer dismiss what he was seeing, but responding required more than recognition. It required an entirely new strategy. Truman began convening meetings with advisors late into the night, asking for assessments from the State Department, the Pentagon, and intelligence agencies. He wanted not just information, but direction, a clear sense of how to counter the political and ideological wave spreading across Europe. His advisors presented options, argued among themselves, debated timelines, and warned of risks. But one theme emerged repeatedly. The United States needed to act before the balance of power shifted irreversibly. Churchill had said it first. Now Truman heard it from every corner of his administration. The warning he had once acknowledged but set aside was now unavoidable. And in the coming months, Truman would make decisions that would form the backbone of the post-war world. But the question remained. The one that had lingered since the night Churchill first knocked on his door at Potsdam. Had he waited too long? The answer was forming in the cables piling on his desk. Soon, it would become impossible to ignore. By the end of 1946, Truman could no longer escape the pattern taking shape across Europe. What had first appeared as isolated political developments, changes in Poland, pressure in Romania, arrests in Bulgaria, had grown into something unmistakable, a coordinated tightening of Soviet influence across the entire region. Intelligence reports described the rise of secret police networks, modeled after the NKVD. Independent newspapers were shut down. Opposition parties were dissolved or absorbed into communist fronts. Politicians who resisted disappeared quietly, without explanation. It was the gradual, methodical consolidation of control that Churchill had warned him about, delivered with such clarity on that quiet night at Potsdam. But now it was no longer a warning, it was a reality. Truman studied each new report with an intensity that unsettled even his closest advisors. The optimism that had colored Roosevelt's final months was gone. The world Truman inherited had shifted, and the post-war dream of a cooperative peace was dissolving into something colder, harder, and far more dangerous. The challenge Truman faced was not simply recognizing the danger, it was responding to it without plunging the world into conflict again. The American public remained weary of war. Congress wanted spending cuts, not foreign entanglements. Veterans wanted homes, not deployments. Truman knew that any major policy change would require persuasion, strategy, and the courage to reshape American expectations. It was during these months that Truman made the decision that would define his presidency, to shift American foreign policy from the hope of cooperation to the strategy of resistance. And in doing so, he began to act on the warning Churchill had given him before the world had even fully healed from its wounds. The first major test came in Greece. By early 1947, the Greek government was on the brink of collapse, besieged by communist insurgents and crippled by economic crisis. Britain, exhausted by the cost of the war, informed the United States that it could no longer provide support. It was a moment that echoed Churchill's fears exactly. If the West retreated, the vacuum would be filled, not by democracy, but by force. Truman gathered his advisors and asked them a simple question. What happens if Greece falls? The answers came quickly. Turkey would be next, then Iran, then the entire Eastern Mediterranean. The balance of power would tilt decisively. And the message to the world would be unmistakable. The United States had won the war, but was abandoning the peace. Truman did not hesitate. On March 12, 1947, he stood before a joint session of Congress and delivered a speech unlike any American president had given before. His voice was steady, his words simple, his tone resolute. "It must be the policy of the United States," he declared, "to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." It was a direct response to the warning Churchill had once whispered, but now it was spoken openly, clearly, in front of the entire world. The Truman Doctrine was born, not from ideology, not from ambition, but from the recognition that inaction was no longer an option. The United States would not wait for the shadow to fall across Europe. It would push back. In London, Churchill read the full text of Truman's speech and nodded slowly. It was the commitment he had hoped Truman would make at Potsdam. It had taken time, longer than Churchill wanted, but now Truman had embraced the role history demanded of him. Yet the warning Churchill gave him had one final chapter, one Truman still needed to confront. Europe lay in ruins, cities had been reduced to rubble, industries had collapsed, winters were harsh, and food supplies remained dangerously low. Even nations untouched by Soviet pressure faced instability. And instability, Truman understood, created openings for influence, openings Stalin was eager to exploit. It was George Marshall, Truman's Secretary of State, who presented the solution. The United States must rebuild Europe, not as an act of charity, but as an act of defense. A continent restored would be a continent resistant to extremism. A continent supported would be a continent unified. A continent rebuilt would stand firm against the pressures Churchill had warned about. Truman approved the plan immediately. The Marshall Plan would become one of the most ambitious undertakings in human history. Billions of dollars would flow to rebuild factories, restore agriculture, repair infrastructure, and stabilize currencies. Nations that had once been enemies would now work alongside each other. Europe would rise not through conquest, but through cooperation. And at its core lay the same principle Churchill had tried to impress upon Truman months earlier. Strength was the only answer to expansion. Prosperity was the antidote to domination. Unity was the safeguard against tyranny. Through 1947 and 1948, as the Marshall Plan took shape, Truman felt something shift within him. The hesitation that had marked his early months in office faded. The uncertainty that had lingered at Potsdam disappeared. He had moved from reacting to events to shaping them. The warning Churchill had given him was no longer an echo. It was a guide. But Churchill was not done shaping Truman's path. In the spring of 1948, Europe faced another crisis that tested the very principles Truman was beginning to embrace. The Soviet Union blocked all land routes into Berlin. 2 million civilians were cut off from food, fuel, and medicine. It was the most direct challenge Truman had faced. If he withdrew from the city, the Western position in Germany would collapse. If he used force, the world could be plunged into war. Truman convened his advisors. Voices argued across the room. Some urged negotiation, others urged confrontation, but in Truman's mind, a memory surfaced. Churchill at Potsdam, warning him that strength was the only language Stalin respected. Truman made his decision. The United States would not abandon Berlin, and it would not fight its way in. It would fly. The Berlin Airlift became a symbol of the post-war world. Day and night, for nearly a year, American and British planes delivered food, coal, and medicine to the trapped city. Children stood on rooftops watching for the candy parachutes dropped by pilots. Mothers cried when the first sacks of flour arrived. And throughout it all, Truman never wavered. The airlift succeeded, the blockade ended, and the world saw that Truman's resolve was now unmistakable. By 1949, the transformation was complete. Truman was no longer the cautious new president who hesitated at Potsdam. He had become one of the principal architects of the post-war order. NATO was formed. Europe was rebuilding. The United States had embraced a leadership role that would define the century. Churchill, still in Britain, watched with the pride of a statesman who recognized that his warning had taken root. In a private conversation years later, Churchill would reflect on Truman's evolution. "He grows on you," he said with a smile. "He grows on the world." But for Truman, the memory of that night at Potsdam never faded. He carried it with him through every crisis, every decision, every moment when the future trembled in the balance. Only years later, long after Churchill had returned to office, long after the Cold War had solidified, long after the two men had become allies once again, did Truman fully acknowledge what he had once struggled to see. Churchill had been right, not because he possessed prophecy, not because he understood Stalin better than Truman, but because he recognized a truth forged in the darkest days of the war. Peace is not preserved by hope alone. It requires vigilance. It requires unity. It requires action. Truman would go on to build the doctrines, alliances, and strategies that sustained that peace for decades. But the spark, the first warning, the one he had heard but not yet understood, came from the man who had walked across a quiet room in Potsdam and said the words that would shape Truman's presidency. "Mr. President, we must not make the mistake of believing the Soviet Union seeks only security." Truman learned the meaning of that warning not in a single moment, but across the unfolding of years, through crises overcome, alliances formed, and principles tested. And in the end, when he looked back on the decisions that defined his presidency, he understood the weight of what Churchill had tried to give him. A glimpse of the future, a warning spoken softly, and a responsibility that history would demand he fulfill. Truman fulfilled it, not immediately, not flawlessly, but fully. And because he did, the world that emerged after the war did not collapse into darkness, but stepped, slowly, painfully, and with determination, into a new and lasting order. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more true stories from the hidden corners of history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel.